Today on the podcast, we are talking economics with Edward Chancellor, who by some accounts is considered to be one of the greatest financial historians of our time. He's written several books on the nature of money, financial crises, and most recently he wrote a book on the true role of interest through history and inside of economics. And someone brought him to our attention, I think, after we spoke with Michael Hudson, because Michael Hudson offers this very critical perspective of the current financial industry and the way that the financial class is taking everything over and starting to degrade our ability to live well because all of our profits are sequestered within this unearned income class of society. And Edward Chancellor has a really interesting perspective on the role that interest has played in all of this, because interest is this hidden economic lever that drives literally everything that's downstream of it. Because if you have high interest rates, then it's expensive to borrow money and you can do less. If you have low interest rates, it's really cheap to borrow money and you have really irresponsible distribution of funds throughout the economy. And then as these forces start to rebalance, you have all kinds of economic crashes. And so Chancellor has a perspective on the way that economies have worked from ancient Sumer all the way to the most recent financial crisis in 2008, and then all of the stuff that's happening right now with big tech and AI. And our conversation tries to encompass a breakneck overview of his work. And so we talk a lot about the role of interest, we talk a lot about history, we talk a lot about speculation, about crises, about collapse, and I think we've come away from the conversation with a better sense of how the economy works and the pieces of it that are incorporated into our best economic models and the pieces that are operating kind of on the back end that are pressuring everything but don't have a gearing into the models that we use to predict how the world is going to work as we make these changes to the financial system.
As always, a huge thank you to our patrons. You are the lifeblood of this project. You are keeping the lights on here. If you aren't already a patron, consider supporting the podcast over at patreon.com/demystifysci. You can give really just a few dollars a month, and it adds up over time. It really matters. And of course, when you become a patron, you get access to our weekly chats, and those Zoom calls are really the highlight of our week. We get to actually touch base about the issues that are important with all of us. And we've found a real friendly community of people who care about similar ideas, similar lines of inquiry. And the other thing is that we're having our first live event this year in Austin, Texas, which I really would love to see you at this year. It's going to coincide with the total solar eclipse, which is happening on the 8th of April. So we're going to get together. We have some incredible speakers lined up. And you can check out a link to the event up here and grab yourself a ticket. We also have some hotel rooms blocked off, so let us know if you want us to reserve you a room. Otherwise,
technically, you have to reserve the room yourself, but we can hand you the reservation.
We'll hook you up. So we will see you there, and we hope you enjoy this conversation.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
The fundamental questions in the hard sciences may be the answer to them may be unknown. The trouble with the soft sciences, and particularly the trouble with economics, is that there are no controlled experiments. There are no grand experiments, and that really leaves one, as far as I see it, open to observation. You can observe and theorize, but you can't actually test your theories. What happens, I think, in economics is it's a subject that really begins to form in the 18th century, marked notably by Adam Smith's publication of The Wealth of Nations in 1776, really the first economics textbook, if you will. And Smith's not a scientist. He's a moral philosopher by training, and there are no equations. There's no maths in The Wealth of Nations. There are intuitions about how economic activity takes place and how nations may grow their wealth. And as you probably know, he has this notion of the invisible hand guiding this, what we would call a complex adaptive system, but this language is not found in Smith. But this invisible hand guides the society as a whole without any obvious direction to the end of, if you will, sort of economic growth activity. I think the science, economics continues in that vein until the middle to late 19th century, and then it begins to develop, pretensions to being more scientific, and introduces notions of equilibrium and starts to become more mathematical. And there is you could say it becomes over time, the whole discipline of economics comes subject to physics envy. It wants to be like physics, and in fact, it draws a lot of the people who become economists, academic economists, are really their core skill is in mathematics or in they possibly move from physics. But for instance, I actually studied history at Cambridge University, and one of my friends in college was a very good mathematician who got a double first and then did a PhD in maths, and then he did a PhD in economics at Harvard and taught at Northwestern for a while, and he's a very bright guy. But my own feeling is that he didn't really. He learned the structure of modern economics in a way. He thought, it's without really developing any economic intuitions, if that means anything to you. The sense of how does everything. You can either learn how things are, work in more almost automatic sense in conventional economics, or you can intuit how people are likely to behave and how things may be different. And I think so. There's this sort of modern, highly mathematical economics, which draws on these models with very unrealistic assumptions. And no one questions the assumption. It's extraordinary. To me, it's extraordinary that you should build a subject or a discipline on assumptions that are unquestioned and unrealistic. And the unrealistic assumptions, for instance, would be, for instance, that everyone works with rational expectations, that human beings are perfectly rational, that human beings have perfect information. And in order to make things simple, for instance, as far as I understand, the economic models reduce everything down to an individual. So instead of getting a sort of a society, you will have an individual player. You have the representative investor or the representative company. You have one company representing the entire economy rather than a myriad of different companies, and millions of different individuals. And for instance, with the individuals, they the representative individual in the model is infinitely lived. So he's not mortal like the rest of us. And there, for instance, in that model, you can't even have any inequality. There's no one better off than anyone else. And I think, from my perspective, I'm more drawn to the view of economics as being closer to biology than to physics, to, as I said, to a complex adaptive system. I wrote a review of a biography of Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, the other day for New York Review of Books. And Hayek is an economist I particularly respect. And what's interesting from about Hayek, relating to the beginning of this conversation, when you said people don't really know the answers, Hayek won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1973, I think, or 74. And his Nobel lecture was called The Pretense of Knowledge, in which he was lambasting the rest of his profession for pretending to a knowledge that they didn't have. And I suppose this was the era in which inflation was running amok. Sort of socialist policies were not really delivering the economic growth that people had been expecting. And when I read the biography of Hayek, what I thought was interesting is that his father had been a very keen botanist. His father was actually a medical doctor, but his passion was botany. And the young Hayek was taken out as a child on botanical field trips and attended his father's lectures in the sort of local Viennese Botanical Society. And there is, in Hayek's writing, a sense of the economy as a much closer, as I say, to an organic evolutionary system. And if you have a complex evolving system, you can see that an individual, first of all, it doesn't look anything like physics, yeah. And secondly, you can see that any intervention in that system is going to be quite difficult to achieve your desired ends. I mean, for instance, if knowledge is diffuse within a society, no individual at the center will have the information necessary to achieve what aims they think they have. So anyhow, so that's, I suppose, where I come from. I as I mentioned earlier, I was trained as a historian, found my way into reading about the history of economic thought through, first of all, being a banker and then turning to writing about finance, investment, and the history of finance and investment. And that drew me into a bit into the history of economic thought. And again, going back to the problem of understanding the discipline of economics, one of the things I came across is that, and this won't surprise you, perhaps, is that as the subject of economics became more theoretical and mathematical, they discarded both the history of economic thought. So they pulled up the ladder from behind them. There was this conceit, really, as far as I see it, that 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 everything that had been thought in the past had been superseded by superior understandings, and that one didn't need to know, the history of the discipline. And they also downgraded the history of actual economic history itself. So, if you lived in this world where if the models and the mathematical modeling that go with them are all that you need, you didn't need to know the sort of fine details of the evolution of the economy in the 19th century, or let's say the banking panic on Wall Street of 1907. They do know, well, they profess to know a bit about the history of the Great Depression, but even that understanding, whenever they do look at economic history, it's through a very rigid theoretical model that is, to my mind, is very blinkered. And Karen.
This is maybe a good place to talk about. You have this example in your book about interest, about the bubble surrounding the Mississippi Company and the policies that were put in place by this guy named Law, who you point to as being someone who completely created a speculative bubble, made all kinds of bad decisions on monetary policy, lost a lot of people their fortunes, and now is viewed as kind of being the frame for how to set monetary policy by people like, I think you mentioned like Janet Yellen. And so I wonder if you couldn't, because that seems directly related to your statement about the forgetting of history.
Yeah, it is. So John Law is a very interesting character. Really, probably without doubt, the most interesting figure in the history of finance, and really one of also an original and brilliant economic thinker, even if his experiment, and he did actually run an experiment, ended in failure. And so Law's great insight. John Law was this Scottish projector in those days, sort of if you will, sort of entrepreneur, someone who comes up with schemes and puts them into practice. But he was also a gambler, and he'd murdered someone in a duel when he was a young man and had to flee England with having been sentenced to death. And then he went around Europe gambling, making money, had a brilliant head for probabilities, and ended up in France in the second decade of the 18th century, and managed to persuade the regents of France, who was ruling France during the childhood of Louis XIV after 1715. No, Louis the 15th, after the death of Louis XIV, Louis XIV in 1715. Anyhow, Law had this idea that money didn't have any intrinsic value. It could be represented by, so to speak, anything. Up until that time, it had been thought that money got its value because of the intrinsic value of gold or silver. And Law said, no, in fact, gold and silver got their value because we use them as money. And in fact, given that there was a shortage of money around, in his view, and that was stifling economic activity and pushing up interest rates, it would be good to get rid of this metallic money and replace it with the paper money. And so he was given permission to start a central bank in France, and that central bank withdrew the metallic currency and replaced it with a paper currency. And there was massive issuance of paper notes in the right to the end of the second decade of the 18th century. And Law's aim was to lower the interest rate. And he succeeded in doing so. He brought the interest rate down from, I don't know, sort of 6 to 8% to around 2%. And there was a tremendous boom in France, tremendous prosperity. And Law also was running this company called what we call the Mississippi Company, that, among other things, laid claim to half of the current United States, excluding Alaska, and had a whole host of other businesses, and also took over the French national debt in exchange for a payment. And all this was funded by Law by printing more and more money. And the Mississippi Company became, the share price went up 20-fold, and Law, who had a big stake in the company, was worth, by his own reckoning, was the richest man who ever lived, and that's probably correct. And then Law's things ran out of control, and inflation appeared, and Law had to put the brakes on. And when he put the brakes on, things got even worse, and they eventually jettisoned the system, and Law was forced to flee the country, flee France without hardly a penny. So this sort of rags to riches and back to rags in a very short period of time. So there's the story. And the French, there was a great blowback against the failure of Law's system, as he called it, which made the French very conservative in finance for the rest of the century, probably for longer. In other words, they sort of rejected modern finance, stocks and shares and government bonds, and the French continue to keep their wealth in gold and under their beds. And so there's Law's experiment. And
do you think that tendency is related directly to Law, their tendency to keep gold under their beds?
People say so. Why not? You see, if if you were living in England in the same time of after the Law period, we had well-developed banking system. We had the government issued bonds that it didn't default on. We had a stable currency, and people who made money put their money in government bonds, and they got regular income. In France, you had to. The government was raising money through different methods. And the main method, as far as I remember, that the French financed, the French government, state financed itself in the late 18th century, was through issuing annuities on individuals. And in fact, they issued you could buy an annuity you could choose who the annuity was for. So the French savers would choose these, I think they'd choose sort of Swiss farm girls who'd already had tuberculosis or who were inoculated against tuberculosis, who weren't likely to die. And that was their main form of government funding. So it was very inefficient and expensive, and partly responsible for the collapse of the French monarchy in the late 18th century and the revolution. So you could it's not too far-fetched to blame Law for downfall of the Ancien regime, for better or for worse. Anyhow, what's interesting, to go back to what we were saying earlier, is the modern economists say, yes, well, Law was really introducing the notion of a managed currency, and a currency that you could increase the circulation of when the economy was doing poorly, and could be used to bring down interest rates. So he is the father of modern central banking. And I say, well, he's not just the father of modern central banking, he's also looks to be the father of you've heard of this concept of quantitative easing, what the central banks did after 2008, when the central banks went out and acquired government bonds in order to bring down interest rates. So that's really what Law did with his central bank and Mississippi company. So I say he's the father of quantitative easing. And then you say, well, okay, he's the father of modern monetary policy, and he's the progenitor of quantitative easing. Isn't that slightly worrying as to where this
where this ride is going?
Experiment, where we're going, and to me, so one of the biographers, an academic biographer of John Law called Antoine Murphy, who's a nice fellow, but he wrote a paper which I read, I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, in which he says, notwithstanding Law's failure, he is the father of modern central banking. And it seems to me that the failure is the one thing one should really be focusing on and wondering why it occurred. And if you don't know your history, I mean, if you know no economic history, and if you know nothing about the history of economic thought, then the sort of Law experiment is not going to register, and I think that's problematic. So, going back to what I was saying earlier, there are no grand experiments in economics. However, there are. I like to think of it being the sort of Petri dish is very dirty, all sorts of different things in there. But you can. One thing's, to my mind, the advantage of history is that you can observe things happening time and time again, and then start drawing sort of generalized conclusions. They're not super robust in a scientific sense, but they are, if you will, sort of intuitions about how things happened in the past and how they might relate to the present. Now, take, for instance, we've been through a fairly tumultuous period in the last 25 years. We had, the so-called dot-com bubble. And the dot-com bubble was this period of, late 1990s, stock markets getting, very, very excited about internet stocks in the same way as they're getting excited about AI today. And, these, I think, the aggregate value of internet stocks by late 99, early 2000 was about $3 trillion. No, sorry, $1 trillion. With negative earnings. It doesn't seem very much today, given that the cryptocurrencies recently went to $3 trillion valuation. Anyhow, seemed a lot then. And very high valuations. The stock market by 2000 was at its highest valuation in history, higher than in 1929, higher than at any other moment. I think roughly twice its historic valuation. And now this is what's interesting, is that the academics, and that includes really the people, the central bankers, who are largely drawn from academia. I mean, the Federal Reserve, I think, has, is the largest employer of finance PhDs in the world. It's got hundreds of them beavering away. I mean, never producing, as far as I can see, anything of much interest, and certainly never producing a forecast that was usable.
I've never heard the verb beavering, but I'm gonna include that in my vocabulary from now on. I love that. It's so evocative.
Americans don't use the term, beavering.
No, we killed all of our beavers about 200 years ago.
I think it was the French, actually.
Yeah. So there's a dot-com bubble. So incredibly extravagant. New companies being launched every other day. There was no business that, no business that was too sort of spurious to be founded and floated on the market. None of them making a penny, and really, anyone, not anyone, but most of them doomed never to make a penny. And you could realize that at the time, and a huge amount of bullshit going around. I mean, amazing. And this is how the academics viewed it. They believed in something called the efficient market hypothesis, which was, going back to what I was saying earlier, that individuals had rational expectations. They were profit maximizing. They had perfect information. Errors of understanding of one individual would be cancelled out by other errors, so that the market would itself arrive at the correct answer. That any future direction of the market from its current position was random, was unknowable. Therefore, a market that was its highest level of history, there was no, to their mind, there was no indication that it might come down, and they didn't accept the notion of a speculative bubble or a speculative mania, and then it all blew up, and then the moment it had blown up, you say, oh yes, this was a bubble after the fact. But as I go back this, we had several hundred years of bubbles. I was writing a history of speculative manias in the late 1990s, and it was quite clear, looking at the history, that what was happening with the dot-com bubble was, it looked very similar to a mania, what's called the British Railway mania in the 1840s. And the reason it was similar is that railways at the time were a revolutionary new communications and transport technology, and people thought it was going to change the world, which it did, but they, overbid everything, and there was a huge collapse. So there you have you have the academics with their unrealistic model, completely blind to what's going on in the real world. Then they, after the dot-com bust, they brought the central bank brought interest rates down to 1%, and a real estate boom started to gather speed. Now that real estate boom, US stock prices, US house price, they went to 3 standard deviations of US house prices to household incomes, which is historically has been a fairly sort of mean reverting measure. As you can imagine, you can't pay $1 million times your income on a house. So you can try, but you're going to go bust. And anyhow, this went to 3 standard deviations from the trend. So that seems like a pretty strong movement away from what would appear to be a mean reverting trend. And if you remember at the time, huge amount of new building going on in many parts of the country, people flipping houses and flipping condos, and people, it
was like an entertainment industry. Right? I mean, like, there were television shows like House Flippers, and
no, exactly.
It was like magazines devoted to it, like an entire.
I think Donald Trump was even sort of running a course, possibly an online course, or possibly an in-person course on how to make money in real estate. I was living in New York in 2005. I remember seeing a sort of poster of Trump, and come join this real estate club. Anyhow, and I knew, we knew there were subprime mortgages, and we knew that people were lying about their loans. We knew that all these houses were being built, and we knew that there were people in prison buying and flipping houses. So we knew that they were lying about their income on their mortgage. And you think, I just mentioned, that the Fed has, 800 PhD PhDs, in its basement. And and Ben Bernanke, who was the chairman of the Fed at the time, and he was formerly head of the economics department at Princeton, and he said there was no bubble in the U.S. At the time. He said that U.S. house prices had never fallen, as if somehow or other the fact that they'd never fallen in the past, well, they'd never been 3 standard deviations from the mean above their valuation. The fact they'd never fallen in the past shouldn't really have told you that they could never fall in future. So there again, central bankers missed, the academics and the central bankers missed the dot-com bubble, went straight into this real estate bubble that was, that nearly brought down the U.S. financial system, and that led to, if you remember, in the crash, U.S. unemployment went up to about 10%. It was, lots of people lost, a lot of money, and the people who were least able to lose the money, people who were less well off, who'd recently bought houses or had investments, a few investments in stocks, their net worth declined much more sharply than those who were better off, and yet I don't think the central bank, the sort of central bankers stroke economists, learned anything from this. They tried to sort of slough off responsibility by saying, oh, it was all to do with poor regulation or something like that. They didn't really bother to tease out, to my mind, what was the underlying problem, and we'll get on to it in a sec. But I thought that, as I mentioned already, that the underlying problem was that that there was a connection between the very easy money of 2000 and 2002, 2003, and the real estate bubble that followed, and one could, that it's pretty obvious. The connection is that if you lower the cost of borrowing, people are likely to borrow more. If you make houses more affordable, you're likely to push up the value of their houses. And yet these really, staggeringly obvious insights are lost to people whose model, who have a type of model blindness.
Are the people at the Fed incentivized, though, to make astute analyses about these things? Because if they're ultimately receiving, did it work? It seemed to have worked out for them in the long run, even despite these crashes, right? Is there some sort of conflict of interest going on there?
Yeah, I don't think it's exactly. I don't think there's exactly a conflict of interest, but I think there is a lack of incentivization. Sure, you don't. If you have an entire profession advocating, holding the same view, advocating the same model, and that view turns out not to have been, justified in retrospect. The question is, does anyone pay? And the answer is no. I mean, Ben Bernanke. I don't have it particularly in for Ben Bernanke. He's emblematic, if you will. But he stayed as Fed chairman. He then, after Lehman Brothers went bust, the central bank started printing a lot of money, and interest rates came down, the markets came up, and then I think Time magazine made him its person of the year in 2009. So you could argue the guy who played a very big role, to my mind, in actually creating the crash, is sort of rewarded for cleaning up a bit of the mess afterwards. And in terms of conflict of interest, there are these. I don't think that they determine. Yeah, there are these conflicts of interest. It of what we call the revolving door. Between academia, then into public service. Say Bernanke going from Princeton to the Fed, and then he went on. Got on leaving the Fed, got some sort of part-time job working for a hedge fund, and Larry Summers went from Harvard to the U.S. Treasury, and then also got some job working at a hedge fund. And Timothy Geithner, he was at the New York Fed, then became U.S. Treasury Secretary, and then became head of a private equity fund. So there are
perhaps a better way of putting it would be, does the Fed see themselves as charged with preventing these speculative manias in any way? Like, is that part of their mandate? Do they feel, I guess it's hard to speak for an institution having feelings, but do they feel that they're charged with that responsibility in some sense? Or are they more on cleanup duty? And maybe it's not a conflict of interest so much as, are we expecting too much out of this institution?
Or maybe even, if I can relate it to something that was in your book on the history of interest, it seems like there's this dichotomy between the service to the financial industry and service to the people that are the pawns in the economy.
Okay, but those are two interesting questions which both deserve consideration. The first one is, does the Fed feel that it has responsibility to prevent speculative mania or to clear up afterwards? First of all, they have, as I said earlier, they have, I think it's less so now, but definitely, in the late 90s, they had a big problem admitting that you could have irrationality in markets, and the speculative bubbles existed. And insofar as they existed, then the argument of Bernanke, academic argument, because he wrote a paper on this subject before he joined the Fed as a governor, which I think he joined in sort of 99, 2000, around then. He wrote, yes, it's better for the central bank to clear up the mess afterwards. And in a way, that that has really been what the Fed's policy has been from 2000, from after the dot-com bust and after the global financial crisis. And people like me are saying, well, it's all very well cleaning up this mess, but you're actually building up more and more problems. There are unintended consequences to what you're doing. I think of it, there is this, I don't know if the Americans have it, but there is this nursery rhyme that the English have, of a little old lady who swallows a fly. Does that mean anything to you? Anyway, the nursery rhyme is, it was an old lady who swallowed a fly, don't know why she swallowed a fly, wriggled and tiggled inside, and then she swallows a spider to catch the fly, blah blah blah. Then she swallows a bird to catch the spider. Then she swallows a goat to catch the bird, and then she swallows a horse. At which point it ends, she's dead, of course. It's that each time, each cure for the problem is actually creating a larger problem that in the end, is fatal. And that's really how I see the sort of progression.
Well, it brings up a wider pattern too, just in governance and institutional leadership, which is that you're not really rewarded for preventing catastrophes. Like we were talking last night, it's interesting, we had this crisis at 9/11 where these buildings were attacked by these airplanes, and they had fighter jets in the air, right? They could have shot down the airliners, but it's interesting because had they shot down the airliners before they collided with the Twin Towers, everybody would think George Bush is a monster for having shot these poor civilians out of the sky. And perhaps it would have, people perhaps think he's a monster for other reasons, but even if he'd had prevented the death of, say, 3,000 people in these towers, no one would ever know. And people would be saying, well, maybe they were going to land the planes. It was going to be fine. No one really knew, right? So you don't, in any leadership position, you're not really rewarded for the things that don't happen.
Yeah, and I think so the argument against intervening, leaning into the speculative bubble, is that you're going to slow the economy and raise unemployment. So that's the equivalent of your fighter taking out the hijacked airplane. So you see the sort of negative, and you don't see the positive that, hey, at least they didn't fly into the World Trade Center and kill an extra couple of thousand people. But the other question you raised was, whose benefit? Who benefits from these policies? Now, if I mentioned earlier that you have, if you have a model of the economy, to keep things simple, which is just of an individual, you have no distributional issues. Weirdly, these policies don't even have a finance. I mean, you can hardly believe it, but they don't even really model the finance system, and money are extraneous to their model. They live in a model of where everything is what they call real, in the sense that that growth comes from changes in the population and changes in technology and so on and so forth, and therefore the messy world of finance, money and finance are assumed away. Now, what that means is you don't consider the distributional consequences, inequality, who benefits and who suffers from your policy. And if you're only focusing, as the Fed was after from the mid 2008 on keeping the financial system from collapsing, you're not thinking about who's benefiting, or perhaps you are, but you're not paying that much attention. What happened in 2000, from really after Lehman Brothers went down, the Fed was lending money to, in effect, rich financial operators who could buy assets at very distressed prices. And then the Fed's policies were ensuring that those assets came back to their previous values, and sometimes went higher. So your policies are making huge fortunes. In this case, it's also protecting protecting the creditors from losses. Now, you might have said, well, if you've lent, against these subprime mortgages, perhaps you should take a loss. But in fact, if the central bank is underwriting them, you're not going to take that loss. So I think that, as you know, I write in the book how this period of central banks suppressing interest rates, pushing up asset prices, has been a major contributor to the growth of inequality. And I also argue, if you remember, that because the interest rate serves a function of I cite a 19th century president of Yale economist called Arthur Hadley, where he says that interest sort of performs a role in the selection of the best industry businesses and the destruction of the least efficient. So it performs a sort of Darwinian role, and I link that to what the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. Again, these are very sort of these are analogies from evolution and nature, and if you thwart the process of creative destruction in an economy by keeping interest rates very low and allowing inefficient businesses to carry on indefinitely. You actually lower productivity growth. And if you lower productivity growth, you're going to lower income growth. So you have a period in which you have very low income growth and you have asset prices going through the roof because very low interest rates push up asset prices, house prices, and stocks and bonds and so forth. So, as I said, the haves, people who have something already, do very well, and the have-nots suffer, and the poor, relatively less well-off people tend to keep what wealth they have in cash, and that cash is suddenly paying no interest in the bank. Meanwhile, the super rich tend to have investments that are leveraged, where they borrow very cheaply. I mean, I remember, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, a friend of mine who used to run a hedge fund said that, a bunch of his friends had got together and they bought some telecoms business with, for $800 million, and they borrowed 700 million at, 2 or 3%, and that debt was completely non-recourse, and they were guaranteed to make an absolute fortune. Well, that's fine. I don't grudge it against this guy, but he was obviously in a very privileged position to make money. Whereas, if you've got a job that doesn't pay great to you, and you're worried that you might get laid off at some stage, you're probably going to keep as much money as you can in cash to pay, and so it makes a difference if you lose that income. And I mean, I think, I can't quite remember, but I think I say in the book that roughly $500 billion a year in lost interest income as a result of the Federal Reserve's policy. So yes, I do think that, well, what do I think? I think that monetary policy will always have, distributional consequences. That whatever the interest rate is, someone's going to be paying it and someone's going to be receiving it, and you can't get away from that. And monetary policy is always is liable to have some effect on asset prices and therefore change people's wealth. And it's problematic. But I think people, the people who make these decisions sweep the whole problem under the carpet and pretend that it's not an issue. They just say, well, if you have a problem with inequality, it's for the politicians to deal with it. Don't blame us. We have, and in a way, because of that type of thinking, it means they become even more narrowly focused on what they consider their prime job. For instance, controlling inflation. Where our job is to keep inflation the 2% target. It doesn't matter if the rest of society completely collapses. That's, I mean, they do. Obviously, I'm overstating, but they have a very narrow focus on what they're trying to achieve, and tend to they tend not to publicly observe, and they tend to disavow responsibility for any unintended consequences. Does that make sense to you?
Well, they almost can't avow responsibilities for the consequences, because I got this feeling that there is it's almost like a law of nature that now that we have these financial systems, they must be allowed to run. Like, it almost feels like it's some, like you say, like a quasi-biological system that operates on top of the meat space of bodies actually interacting and people, where there is money and people need their money to be making money. And so the financial industry is this system that everyone is kind of invested in a little bit, and they're kind of culpable in a little bit. And so everyone needs it to do well. And so they're kind of like, well, I don't really understand what's happening, but there's really smart people who are, and it's very complex. And so we'll let them do it because, the stock market goes up, and I have mutual funds, I have a retirement fund, I have a pension fund. And so everyone is just accepting it as a law of nature at this point, that there's a financial system. The financial system will, you point to in Sumer that some of the earliest interests or interest rates were on barley, like an interest rate of 33% on barley. And to me, I'm like, okay, that makes sense, because you put barley in the ground, barley will grow, one seed will produce many more seeds. That's an inherent biological reality of, if you're a good farmer, you will always produce more barley, barring, an act of God. But money is not quite like that. And so now that we've worked out these systems that do seem to create a biological reality of money, that money will always make more money, we're perfectly happy to let them run and kind of take our hands off of them, because we're like, okay, somebody's running this.
Well, so I think the problem is that we have the approach is slightly hybrid. You have, on the one hand, a sort of laissez-faire approach to markets, and on the other hand, you have a central bank which has the capacity to print money and to manipulate the interest rate, and it can underwrite the markets. So there was this term coined when Alan Greenspan was the head of the Federal Reserve after in 1998, a big hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management went bust, super levered. And what's interesting actually is that it had two very prominent economists on its board, the Long-Term Capital Management, one of whom actually was awarded the Nobel Prize, I think in the same year that the hedge fund went down. Anyhow, as this hedge fund was going down, it was putting Wall Street under stress. So the Fed went out and, I think, supplied liquidity to the market and cut interest rates. And that coincides with the final leg of the internet bubble. So you have the central bank underwriting the market against losses. So this is not actually a sort of free market economy any longer. It's a market in which there is a dominant player who is which is acting to change outcomes. And I think that that's problematic. But the role of the central bank in changing the outcomes over long periods of time is not particularly acknowledged. There was an amazing chart that came out. I suppose it was quite a long time ago, about 2013, produced by the New York Fed, researchers at New York Fed. And what it showed was over the previous 20 years, more than 100% of the gains of the US stock market, of the S&P 500, occurred at around the time of the Fed's interest rate meetings. In other words, which seems to be more than coincidental, that the entire market gains from this 2-decade period came from I can't remember if it was the run-up or the immediate aftermath of the Fed interest rate committee meeting. So that's telling you the extent to which outcomes are determined by, if you will, a committee of economists sitting in a building in Washington. It's sort of extraordinary, but it's also telling you, I think, that the market outcomes are not real market outcomes. They're not really decided by individuals. I don't have a huge. I mean, I used to write a column called "The Inefficient Market." So it doesn't mean that I'm not a great, I don't think the markets always work perfectly. I've written hundreds of articles showing why they don't work perfectly. However, I think they work better than, market probably works better than one in which the outcomes are determined by, a group of people sitting in a room around a desk, a table.
I want us to pivot towards the function of interest rates in economies, but I wonder if we couldn't take a quick break. I wanted to get a little bit more coffee and use the restroom.
Sure.
Before we get any farther in the conversation, I have to ask you for a very small favor. Would you consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci and donating a couple dollars a month to the podcast? It is really, really important to us that we build a strong patron subscriber base, because that is what allows us to do all of the things that we want to do with this podcast, which is have conversations that are not bordered by any kind of sponsorships or advertisements. It is our ability to hold live events, and it is our ability to do the podcast full time, as opposed to having to split our time between a million different ways in order to get a little bit of cash so we can buy the peanut butter and jellies that we need to survive. If you've already done so, thank you very much. If you haven't, the link is up here, and we would absolutely love to see you there. Thank you.
You there?
Yes, we are. How are you doing?
Bad?
It's pretty late where you are, right? You're in GMT time?
Yeah, it's coming up 6 o'clock in the evening.
That's not too bad.
Are you? Are you in New York? No.
No, we were. So we did grad school there because we went to Columbia, and then afterwards we hadn't seen trees in a good 5 years, and so we moved out to the Pacific Northwest, and we live at the border between California and Oregon right now in a little town of 20,000 people.
Yeah, I've never been to that. I've never been to. I've never been in that. You're south of Portland, then, is that right?
We lived in Portland for a little bit, but now we're south by about 5 hours.
Yeah.
It's very much the boonies, but it's nice because it's kind of our monastic period. We just we come here to work and do nothing else. We know no one. We
spend a lot of time in San Francisco as well, so we go there to do all of our social engagements and then return to work here.
Well, I live in the West Country of England, up in the hills near Exmoor, so it's also pretty secluded.
Is that up by where the lakes are?
No, the Lake District is up in the northwest, whereas I'm in the southwest. It's going down towards Cornwall. That little sort of slither at the corner of England, like a sort of wedge of cheese. I'm at the upper end of that wedge of cheese. So yeah, I also cogitate the world on my own.
It's easier to do when it's quiet. I think that there's just a certain level of distraction in the cities, especially when you know a lot of people there. My family lives in San Francisco, and so, or in the area, and so when we go visit, it's just dinners and appointments and events and so many things to do and so many distractions that it's hard to get into the deep space of, okay, there's much to do.
So, and there's another aspect, I think, which I think about, which is that if you want to seek out the truth, if you can be so presumptuous to engage in such an activity, it's sort of better to do it on your own. And if you spend too much time in the company of other people, you get sucked into the sort of groupthink, into crowd mentality, and then once you've got groupthink, you then what comes after that is, as the sort of concept of cognitive dissonance. You stop seeing what the group doesn't believe in. When I was reading about this, ages ago, sort of 20 odd years ago, with some American, I don't know, whether it was behaviorist discussing this issue, and he came up with quite a good line, which was that I'll see it when I believe it. In other words, that you only see what you already believe. And I think you go back to what our discussion has been, about how did these academic economists and central bankers not see what was very obvious to anyone walking down the street. Everyone, in a way, the less trained you were in the subject, the more likely you were to observe something that the most highly trained, credentialed, and intelligent, I suppose, people couldn't see. And so I think that being away from the crowd is quite useful for forming for forming ideas and trying to understand what actually is going on.
It's a very strange feeling to realize that in many disciplines there is no one who has that answer. And that when you realize that answer, when you have the bent towards research, you're the only one that can put together the argument that makes a case for how it is. And it's valuable work, but I think that it can be very, I don't know, just kind of weird sometimes.
So take the subject, that I just written this book about, on the history of interest. I think I came to the subject knowing, having thought a bit about it over the previous 15 years, but not particularly deeply. I knew what I knew the effect that changing interest had, for instance, on asset prices, or at least I thought I did. But when I got more deeply into the book and read, both the history of interest, but also the history of economic thought, I sort of came to this understanding that really this question of interest lay at the heart of all economic activity, and the reason it lies at the heart of all economic activity is that all our activities take place over time, and they all have to be coordinated in some way. And you then have to think, well, what is doing the coordination? I say, well, actually, it's the rate of interest is influencing how much we save, what type of investments we make, how much we borrow, how much we consume, or how much of our consumption we defer into the future, what the returns on our investments are going to be, and then given that the productivity comes from the type of investments we make, what type of productivity or economic growth we're having. So you can see that when you start thinking about it, this is something that begins to affect really just about everything that's going on, both in the world of finance, sort of, most obviously, because it's a financial factor, but also then the world of finance then starts affecting what's happening in, so to speak, the real world. And to go back to what we were saying earlier, the modern economists don't really see a financial system. The idea that the financial system could affect the real world is not in their models. Anyhow,
actually, but hold on, before we move on from that, like, I've heard that many times. We've had Steve Keen on, we've had Michael Hudson on, and now you're saying this as well, that these models don't include this. But can you for my sake and maybe for other listeners, lay out how that's possible? Because it just seems like it's impossible for me to believe. Every single time that somebody says that, I'm like, surely that can't possibly be true. I'm like, there's no way. How is that possible?
There is this notion that money is, they call it a veil. It's something it's a diaphanous veil that is put over, so to speak, the real economy, and it doesn't change anything. In their way of thinking, if you have too little money, then prices will fall, and if prices fall, you're going to get a bit of problems with that. But too much money, you're going to have some inflation. But otherwise, it doesn't really matter. Or you can even say, if you have too much inflation, then everyone is, you have twice as much money. The prices of everything double. Hey, but you still got the same number of houses, same number of cars, same number of jobs. Money doesn't matter. Then you say, well, what about this rate of interest? Oh, well, the rate of interest just represents, the number of, the age, the population and the age structure of the population, and the new technologies that are coming along, and the education of the population. These are all the factors that really matter, and the rate of interest is determined by these real matters, not by what we central bankers are doing. We're just sort of playing around on the sidelines. So it's very weird, because they, on the one hand, have a really predominant influence on the system, and influence the financial system, and as I say, the financial system then goes on to influence, what's happening in the world, and yet some or other they don't. They don't take that on board. And then, so you've had Michael Hudson on, as he wrote a rather good book called "Killing the Host." Have you read that book? Where he argues that I suppose he can. I can't quite remember because I read it a few years ago, but he argues that you get a parasitical financial system that then is actually destroying the real economy, or the civilization, if you want to be a bit of a broader brush. And I think it's I think I pretty much agreed with everything he wrote. And Steve Keen I have also known for a while, and I think it was sort of via Steve Keen was very keen on this economist called Hyman Minsky. Does that mean anything to you? So, I don't know if you talked about it. So Minsky is very different from these economist types that we've been talking about. He's well trained. He went to Harvard. He did his PhD under Joseph Schumpeter, who we talked about. But then Minsky actually had an understanding of banking and finance, and he realized how really the financial system could change over time, and how it could become unstable over time, and then it would reach a point of stability that would end in crisis and collapse when people got into too much debt, and when those debts were determined by could only were supported by asset prices that were themselves inflated. This is exactly the situation we were in the US real estate market probably from sort of 2004 to 2008, to the blow up. And Minsky, brilliant economist, but he wasn't given an Ivy League job. He was sent to the University of George Washington in St. Louis, which is a good university, but And at one stage, Minsky, but I think, because I read Steve Keen writing about him, Minsky, probably 25 years ago. I started, when I was doing work on the credit boom in 2003, I started reading a lot of Minsky, and I thought, Christ, this Minsky is very useful for what's going on now, because Minsky was saying that this is the beautiful sort of yin and yang of Minsky's thought, is that stability breeds instability. That if you have too much stability in the system, or if you impose stability from above, in other words, if the central banks create stability, it's not Minsky saying that, it's me saying this. If the central banks create stability by lowering interest rates, giving the aura of stability, then people respond by taking on more debt and creating asset price bubbles, and that becomes a highly unstable situation. So that was the dynamic that was taking place in the early 2000s. And Minsky, when I was reading it, somewhere he says, he comes to this realization, he writes, no one up there understands economics. So there is a brilliant academic economist who's not allowed into the sort of top tier, most prestigious institutions, but without doubt is the most, I was going to say the most influential, the most important economist in the post-war period, to my mind. And he's saying, well, the economists don't understand economics. And from his perspective, and I suppose the same as, I'm a sort of Minskian at heart too, it's because they don't understand the interaction between finance and the real economy. It's because they don't understand money. And Minsky, incidentally, actually had, I think some of his early work was on banking systems, and he actually was a director of a small regional bank. So he sort of understood balance sheets and cash flows and this and that, this sort of nitty gritty of banking.
This seems directly related to what Shiloh was pointing to earlier, which is that there seems to be a strange incentive at the top of these economic pyramids that the policy is not set on the purity of economic principles. It almost appears to be set in order to allow the roller coaster ride to continue, because the people that are in the financial industry that are benefiting from the policies that might shake the structure of the society apart are perfectly happy to keep benefiting. They want to ride it for as long as it'll go, right? Like, it's not like after the 2008 crash, you saw all of these financial sectors do a heavy mea culpa and say, things have really gotten under control. These are the new rules that we're going to institute. This is how we're going to prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. It just seems like this hungry maw that just wants more.
Well, I didn't quite agree with that. First of all, there was a huge amount of financial regulation.
But it wasn't the financial industry itself that was like, please regulate us. It was, I feel like the pressure came externally by the people who got completely screwed, who were then like, we have to regulate this.
Well, so the question is, when you're dealing with go back to, saying earlier, you complex system, how do you regulate a complex system? It's not as straightforward as it might appear. In fact, Hyman Minsky in his writing says, well, you have a financial crisis, and certain modes of behavior are deemed to be responsible for the crisis. So we regulate those modes of behavior. And then a bit of time passes. Some smart people say, how do we get around these rules? They get around the rules in one way or another, and they build up the conditions for another crisis. So if you go down the route of regulation alone, you're going to end up with an infinite amount of regulation, which is sort of where we've got. When I was working for investment firm in Boston, I'd have to report my wife's money market funds to the regulator. You say, who the hell cares about a money market fund? Anyhow, so there isn't, believe me, there is an infinite amount of regulation, and is, it, as I say, it stretches to thousands of pages. But what, to my mind, what's interesting is that it never really, they can never really get to the problem because, as I say, the system is complex. And if you want and I suppose, again, one of the conclusions I came to when writing the book is the interest rate has a much more profound impact on determining how much how much debt people take on, how much, how the quality of the debt, the valuations of the assets, and so forth. And therefore, the interest rate itself is the prime regulator of the financial system. And if you push the interest rate down to zero, you will be creating a potentially massive destabilizing force in your financial system. And you have to then offset that with regulation. And that, to my mind, well, I'm not being original here, to say you have monetary policy and your regulatory policy pushing in opposite directions. And I would say that in that sort of tug of war, the monetary policy is going to overwhelm the regulations. And so it's interesting, that last year we had a little regional banking crisis. Where Silicon Valley Bank went bust, and then First Republic bust, went back, and then there was a bank in New York called Signature Bank that went down. And Signature Bank actually seemed to be sort of quite heavily involved in the crypto world. But on its board was Barney Frank, and Barney Frank was the former congressman who had been whose name was on the legislation, the Dodd-Frank legislation that was put, that came up after the financial crisis. So it's and as in my book, I'm saying, well, actually, that this regulation is never going to work with the interest rates, with the monetary policy set at such a low rate. So it becomes a sort of divine justice that Barney Frank should actually be on the board of a bank that goes under. I've got nothing against Barney Frank, just that it was, for me, or you call it an irony, that it was a nice irony, sweet irony for me that he should be on the board. But there we are. In other words, just that regulation does not in itself work, or that complex systems are difficult to control. I think this goes back to a number of our conversation, which is that you have to try and understand the system you're dealing with before you actually try and control it. And you also then have to work out whether your controls are actually going to work or not. So if you misconceive the nature of the system, then you're obviously going to run into trouble. But I mean, is this a vested interest? Perhaps, yeah, and perhaps it's a vested interest. So it may be more a sort of myopia or short-termism that if you, and this would seem to be quite typical of the sort of policy-making class across a whole swathe of different areas. If only if we can deal with the problem at hand, then the other problems can be dealt with later. As for the vested interests, you'd have to have a really a profound reform of the monetary system to change it, and obviously the huge amount of vested interests in not changing that. And in the near term, so take my argument that the system got corrupted and distorted and created this huge bubble of virtual wealth. well, then that virtual wealth needs to evaporate. And then we get back to your problem of, do you take the hijack, do you order the US Air Force jet to take the hijacked plane out? Well, if you blow up this wealth, people think they have wealth, and it turns out to be a mirage. They're not going to really be pleased with you for revealing it to be worthless.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating to me that the deep history of regulating interest and really the whole concept and the controversy surrounding usury was originally in the realm of moral philosophy and really in the realm of religion. And it seems like my 30,000-foot view of the history of that development of that philosophy is that it comes down to the idea that people should not be making money off of interest in so much as it's not risky to them. And so in some sense, you're pricing the risk, and that comes down to the true moral element of it, is how much risk is really at play. Do you think, how do you think that that's playing out today in terms of these interest rates? Do you think that they adequately are pricing risk, or are people in some sense benefiting still? Is the financial industry still benefiting from a riskless situation in so much as they continue to be bailed out by the central government and so forth?
Well, things have changed over the last couple of years. First of all, I would say that all loans are risky. We have this idea. They talk about the risk-free interest rate being the interest rate on a US Treasury bond, but they're not risk-free. I mean, the 30-year Treasury bond lost more than 50% of its value when interest rates started to rise from the spring of 22. So they're not, so you've definitely got a risk, and Treasury bonds if the interest and if they're overpriced and the yield on them is too low. As the yield goes up, then you're going to lose a lot of money. And then you've got all these other, these other type of credits that are, if you will, priced off that supposedly risk-free rate. And so all lending involves risk, and that does to some extent legitimize the lending. And that was an observation. That even in the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church was, opposed to usury, they would recognize they was then introduced a sort of exception that where there was a risk, and in fact, under those circumstances, you can see that an insurance policy and an interest yield, the premium you pay on an insurance policy and the interest yield are connected. So there is definitely an element of insurance in the interest charge. And I suppose again, my argument was that if you take the insurance premium, the embedded in the interest, down to very low level, you will it will be inadequate to cover potential losses. And in fact, the failure of Silicon Valley Bank was because it had bought too many US Treasury bonds. So it was piled up with risk-free debt, and that blew it out of the water. It had too much. It had a lot of depositors who initially were not being paid any deposit income, but Silicon Valley Bank had to do something with money, so they put it into these Treasury bonds, and it said the Federal Reserve said, "Don't worry, we're going to keep interest rates lower for longer." And then suddenly inflation comes along, the Fed changes, and the Silicon Valley bonds go down and in value, and Peter Thiel gets on on a conference call to a whole load of venture capital guys in Silicon Valley and says, "Take your money out of Silicon Valley; it's going bust." And the next day, $20 billion of deposits fly out of the door, and lo and behold, the bank is bust. So I think that's a nice example of how risk is built up in the system when the interest rates are very, very low. Had Silicon Valley bought bonds that were yielding 5%, rather than, I imagine they were buying bonds yielding sort of 1.5% or 2%, then it probably would still be in business today.
And in the sense of this discovery of yours that interest plays a much larger role than anybody realizes or really acts upon, to me that seems like there must be an acknowledgement of the role of interest, because we do have a body that sets the interest rates. And historically, there have also been people that set the interest rate, and there's arguments about what that interest rate should be set on. And so the fact that it's something that's so managed and central to the system seems to imply that people do understand its importance. Did you come to the conclusion that they were misunderstanding the relationship, or what was the discovery for you?
Well, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't say that I discovered the importance of interest. You can find it in a lot of the earlier writings on interest. I mean, to my mind, you pick up the sort of pamphlets written by early English economists in the 17th century, they have more insightful things to say about interest than people writing, academic economists writing today. But even in the 20th century, the great American economist called Irving Fisher, who was at Yale, he wrote a book called The Theory of Interest, in which he calls interest an omnipresent phenomenon. I mean, he argues, along with economists like Friedrich Hayek, who I mentioned earlier, he argues that interest is related to our natural impatience. Do you want something today, or do you want it, at some stage in the future? And if you want it today, but you're prepared to defer the consumption to later, you need some compensation. So Fisher called that crystallized impatience. He said the interest was crystallized impatience. So I think that's Fisher has very important insights, and a lot of other people believed that, thought along the same lines. Let's say before the Second World War, it's just in the sort of post-war period, they sort of lose interest in what interest is, in the nature of interest. They say, oh well, this the interest rate is determined by, as I mentioned earlier, these sort of real factors that we can't influence. Our job is just to control inflation, and therefore we'll put it up and down according to what we consider inflationary forces. The Fed also has a mandate to control unemployment, and so you just see the interest as a policy lever, and you don't really have any sort of deep insights into this lever. And actually, when I come to think about it, I write about how the role of interest is all these different functions. It plays a very important role in valuing assets. In fact, it's without interest you can't value an asset, because the valuation is really the discounted stream of future income. So if you didn't have an interest rate, then everything would be worth an infinite, a perpetual stream of income would be worth a infinite amount of money. And actually, as you can see from that, is not only that, is that two assets would be worth the same as one, because they both have infinite values. Sort of the whole thing becomes absurd. But and interest, we talked earlier, determines what type of investments you make and so on. So this is a very rich world that is, as I say, ignored, and I don't, I don't really know what one can do about it. You can't, there was Max Planck is reported to have said that science progresses with the death of one scientist at a time, and that's really the problem of economics. That it needs to. I mean, I'm sure Steve Keen and Michael Hudson would have said the same thing. It needs sort of complete rebuilding, and yet the people who in the building don't they don't want to go out anytime soon, so they don't, and then go back to this question of cognitive dissonance. They don't understand, they don't understand the criticisms, or they think that the criticisms are unfounded and polemical, and can be safely ignored. But if you're living through a period we've been living through of this rising inequality and stagnant growth, and then accompanying that, obviously, swelling resentment against the, what do you want to call it, the elite, the policy, the establishment, then you're building up to really a potentially very dangerous situation. And I don't think this is really just I don't think this is really just a problem of economics. I think I can see it in in other areas too. I mean, I think that public health. I think the public. During the pandemic, I sort of came to the view that the mathematical epidemiologists, public health people, and the pharma companies were all involved in a rather sort of similar combination of vested interest, revolving door, phony modeling, phony and unrealistic modeling. It looked very similar to my mind, and I didn't know anything about epidemiology before the COVID thing started to break. But when I did then sort of read a book about epidemiology, and I thought, Christ, these guys are as bad as economists. I mean, they, going back to your question of incentives, they have absolutely no incentive to get things right. It's really quite extraordinary. There was someone at the CDC who was modeling some outbreak of disease and apparently the model said, well, it was going to cause 15 billion deaths worldwide. You say, well, hang on a sec, that actually, more than, roughly twice the number of people. These are the type of errors that people with models are liable to make. And I think epidemiology is probably a great deal simpler than economics, but it's still a world in which that's a poor modeling, vested interests, and revolving doors. And if you have too much of this going on, you will get I think you'll get a society that becomes unstable. And I think that's sort of really where we've been heading for quite a long time. I think it's very disturbing, but not much I can do. I mean, one can write, but one can write, but no one, you can't really expect to make any difference. I think Keynes writes somewhere about he wrote a book, a collected essay called Essays in Persuasion, where he says it's easy to have ideas, it's almost impossible to persuade people of them. So we just have to, one has to do one's best and feel sort of quiet exasperation that nothing really much seems to change.
Yeah,
I was wondering if maybe you could respond to Michael Hudson's idea that the real crisis in our financial institution is that we have this idea that GDP represents the health of an economy, except that GDP reflects all of these different rentier, well, as he calls it, rentier classes of unearned income, is how he would say it. And that we could put this whole train back on the rails if we were to stop taxing the end users so heavily, let's say the middle class and the less than middle class, and we taxed more heavily those financial transactions and those rentier transactions. What do you make of his concept of unearned income?
I don't quite remember that, from reading his that book I mentioned earlier, Killing the Host. But yeah, I may remember him being highly critical of the growth of the financial services industry. Historically, the financial service industry was, I think, about sort of 2.5–3% of GDP. And then it sort of triples in size to 9–10% of GDP. Now, it grows in size at a time when actually, everything huge, advances in computerization and technology should have actually lowered the cost of finance. I mean, you can get a stock index fund, which for free. It doesn't cost you anything, and yet the income of the investment industry will continue to grow. So there is, and then it's not just, and then the amount of profits. I think I mentioned this in my book. After the financial crisis, the what's called the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate sector, their share of total profits is larger than it is than even before the financial crisis. Again, remarkable, yeah. And so you've got and then I think I also mentioned that it's the growth of the financial sector that actually drives the economy. So you have, is the largest contributor to GDP growth. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I don't know about Michael Hudson's exact taxing suggestions, but I think it's probably true to say that. Well, let's say that 2/3 or 3/4 of financial income are rents, in inverted commas, and those rents are in a way unearned but extracted from society. And again, go back to what I'm writing about, is where do those rents come from? I say, well, actually, the monetary policy creates those rents. I should know it because I was working for an investment firm, and at the end of the day, your income from an investment firm comes as a share of the fees on the assets that you're managing. So you could just do absolutely nothing. Let's assume our clients don't realize doing nothing and stick their money with you. If the stock market goes up 20% that year, your income goes up 20%. Then the other thing to think about is, if in the financial world, where is that income coming from? Well, it's actually coming from the pensions of people whose money you're managing. So every dollar you take, I'm sure Michael Hudson will agree with this, but every dollar you take that is sort of, in a way, rent, is $1 less for someone to be able to consume in future. But in fact, it's worse than that, because if that wealth was going to compound over time, every dollar you take today, well, it may be $2 or $3 from someone's future income. So when I sort of feel this when you see, these big, swanky investor, hedge fund billionaires, they're sort of grown fat on what Justice Louis Brandeis called other people's money. So I think I think I'm all in favor of shrinking the financial system, and I think one of the problems, I'm probably mentioning it somewhere in the book, is also tremendous brain drain. That you have too many smart people go into finance. It's particularly true in England, but it's also true in America. I mean, obviously I went into it, but my job I suppose I've been doing financial stuff for can't remember, 33 years roughly. But I spent most of my time analyzing stuff, and most of my time not really in a finance job, probably 2/3 of my time not employed. So I think I see a lot of very smart people in finance who probably should have been doing something else. I mean, you have all these, as you're probably aware, you have all these engineers, who literally having qualified in engineering, then go into finance. It seems problematic, and then in this country, it seems to me that we have now a very inefficient civil service, and yet you have all these, anyone who's, I'm not saying everyone who's smart, but a huge number of very smart people have been drawn into finance, because they want some money. And then if you get, by talking about how high priced house prices are, if you have this situation that you push up the value of prices, so house prices, say they're impossible to buy, you actually push people into finance, because finance is one of the jobs where you can earn several times the average pay if you're reasonably good, and then of course you can afford to live in a house. So it's a slightly downward spiral. So yeah, I would I definitely agree with Michael. I mean, I agree with his thesis of killing the host. I think that an overblown finance system kills the host. And there is a I can't quite remember his name. There is a economist at one of the London universities, at SOAS, who says in the modern age, the finance mostly goes to finance, that the system is consuming itself.
Hey folks, good news. We're having our first live event this year in Austin, Texas on the 7th and 8th of April. It's going to be an incredible lineup of speakers and workshops and very interactive sessions. So please come over and grab a ticket at this link, and I'll see you there.
And, I think, as I point out in the book, we have this huge amount, again, I argue, generated by the low rates of interest. There's a huge incentive to financial engineering, to leverage buyouts, to companies buying back their shares and so forth, borrowing money to buy back shares, companies borrowing money to take over other companies, which creates monopoly, which has its own ill effects. And so you get to the point where the amount of more debt, more finance is being used for financial engineering purposes than for actual investment purposes. Now, I wouldn't personally be in favor of again the state stepping in and saying this is how you should allocate your money, and these are the type of investments you should make. But a system that has become, again, that corrupted is inviting state intervention to say, well, if you finance guys can't spend all your time just leveraging up your dollars and not really investing in the economy, we will determine what investment will be. And I mean, personally, I think that that will create the cure will be as bad, if not worse, than the disease. But you can see things going down that route. Anyhow, yeah. So I think we're all agreed. At least Steve Keen, Mike Hudson, and myself, I'm sure, are all agreed that the finance system has become sort of egregiously large. We probably would have different solutions, and that's another thing. I think you could say I'm more on the sort of free. My natural inclination is more towards sort of laissez-faire, to allow the complex system to manage itself. But if you see the complex system becoming so corrupted, you then become highly critical. And what I find today is that sort of, if you will, people who are more, on the left, sort of traditionally more sort of socialist interventionist critiques, they're very similar to the sort of more free market stroke libertarian critics. Everyone, the people who are critical, their analysis is fairly similar, I'd say. Their solutions might be rather different, but their analysis of the problem is quite similar. For instance, I have a friend who's an investor who I'd say he was pretty free market in his thought, but he wrote a book called The Myth of Capitalism, this guy called Jonathan Tepper. And what he's arguing there is that you've had this tremendous concentration of business in America, so that all these businesses have been taken over, and you've had this growth of monopoly. And if you look at the original classical economics, as expressed originally by Adam Smith, he's saying monopoly is evil. Monopoly destroys the capacity of an economy to grow. And Smith argues, he says somewhere that you can seldom put people of the same trade together without them hatching some conspiracy against the public. And Smith is very aware of this. And this is back in the mid 18th century, and yet we've allowed sort of monopoly to run riot. And as again, because I'm being sort of in my book trying to sort of reduce everything to one argument, I say, well, actually, the very low interest rate facilitates all these takeovers and plays a role. It's not the only thing. Very lax regulation, but it plays a role in allowing the concentration of American businesses, which exacerbates inequality, destroys growth. And insofar as I think once you get into areas like big tech and big pharma, it then really threatens individual liberties. I mean, it's very, very worrying to my mind, the growth of monopoly of monopoly power in America.
I mean, even on the level, setting aside big tech and pharma, even on the level of grocery stores. I don't know if you've been following this massive merger that's ongoing where there's, I think that it's the Kroger family of businesses that have taken over the large regional supermarkets basically in every region of the country. And so whereas there used to be, 6 or 7 different corporations that serviced these different regions and they were in competition with one another, right? Like there's Albertsons, there's Safeway, there's Lucky, there's Ralph's, there's Fred May, like there's all these grocery stores.
Yeah.
And now there's one company that owns basically all of them. I think that Kroger has swallowed like 9 different grocery corporations. And there's an active debate right now about whether or not they're going to be allowed to swallow, I think it's Albertsons. Like it's in the courts right now where the courts are trying to decide if the merger can go forward, because if they do that, then there's basically no remaining grocery stores that are not in the Kroger family, I think in the entire Western United States. And there's been a lot of talk of greedflation, where the rising costs of groceries, sure, some of it is caused by inflation, but another part of it seems reasonably plausibly caused by the fact that there is a single monopolistic grocery chain that can set whatever price it wants.
Yeah, no, I've come across greedflation. I think, what can I say? They allowed these monopolies to, or cartels, whatever you want to call them, or oligopolies to form. They allowed the mergers to pass because at the time of the merger, they always said, "Look, don't worry. Our industry will be more concentrated. There'll be fewer supermarkets, but we'll lower prices." So they always said that they were lower prices, and in particular, there was some professor at the University of Chicago who was always hired as an expert witness, saying, yes, actually, these mergers lower prices and therefore they're good for the consumers. And apparently this guy, earned, tens of millions of dollars as an expert witness for, helping to push through these, these mega mergers. And, there was just, incredible lack of regulation. And to my mind, I've been arguing, the problem of regulating a complex system, and I think that I still hold that's true of the whole system, but not a unit within a complex. It's easier to regulate a unit within a complex system, in other words, or an industry. It's not, I don't think that sort of effective competition regulation or antitrust regulation is beyond the wit of man. And they simply didn't do it. And they, I think I mentioned in the book, I think in 2013, the US Justice Department didn't bring a single antitrust case. This is the time when American business is more concentrated, perhaps than at any time since the Gilded Age. And if you remember, the Gilded Age of the 19th century is followed by Teddy Roosevelt, applying antitrust regulation to break up, the Standard Oils of this world. And it just wasn't done, and now I think the tide is turning. I think I can't quite remember the name of, is she called Lena Khan, the Biden head of the FTC. Anyhow, she is very is much more active on the antitrust front. I think I see it in the papers this week. Washington is looking into the so-called, these big tech companies and their role in AI. So I think that in the end, whether it comes, from the left or the right, there will be I think there will be antitrust action. Either that, or the big guys will have completely won, in which case we'll all be sort of serfs of one sort or another. There was someone a book I thought was very, very good on this, relating to big tech, is a book by a woman I think she's at the Harvard Business School, called Shoshana Zuboff. Does that mean anything to you? It's called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And to me, it was sort of, I thought it was a bit like reading Marx or something like that. It sort of had this sort of tremendous, it was powerfully analytical, but also had, was full of passion. And and she was saying, what's she saying? She's saying that, big tech was mining our data. She was making such a fuss about the concentration of business, but it becomes, well, I think she probably does, because the Googles and Facebooks of this world, they're the whales that eat all the plankton, all the startup plankton gets swallowed by these whales. So,
and there's something weird about the way that these whales are operating now, which I feel like is distinct from the technological developments of the past, where you can look through history and you can see moments of technological development where before you had to have people weaving on looms, and there was tremendous need for their physical presence in the factories. Then all of a sudden you have the machine age come around. automation makes it so that you need fewer people in the factories. And that creates this shift towards, okay, well, all of these excess people are then shunted into whatever other industry needs them. And with big tech, it seems like the goal is, at the end of the day, to create automated systems that completely eradicate the need for people.
Singularity.
Right. And that feels like it has never come before, because we've never been at a point where our technological ability is such that not only do we have machines, but we also have an artificial intelligence that can drive the machines. And so you have this narrowing of the number of people that are required to do something. Like Tesla I don't know if you saw this, but Tesla's building these humanoid robots. And there was just a video that they put out of this robot folding a shirt, right? So it sits at this table, it pulls a shirt very, very slowly, like it's not a fast machine, but it pulls this crumpled shirt out of a basket, lays it on the table, slowly folds it, and then puts it to the side and reaches for the next one. And I think that they're aiming to make the first generation of robots $20,000. Where I'm like, what does that do? I mean, that's cheaper than a worker. And if the machine starts to run faster, that's a $20,000 investment for, 20 years, as opposed to having to pay somebody $20,000 a year to do that. Doesn't that just completely eradicate the entire economic system of work? Doesn't it inexorably push us towards financial capital as being the only possible source of income? You already kind of pointed to the fact that that's where people are going.
Well, I don't know. I mean, first of all, and we have we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but historically, what we see is technology has taken away jobs, and that's freed people to do other stuff, and the productivity improvements that come with that have raised incomes historically. I think what obviously does appear different from big tech is that they employ far fewer people. So the Googles and Facebooks of this world, compared to say what General Motors or Ford were employing, when automobile industry started to get going, and in the first decades of the 20th century. Whether I don't know quite what with the AI future. I've done work, as mentioned, on technology bubbles in the past, and it tends to be during the sort of early euphoric phase that obviously there tend to be sort of exaggerations of what's going to happen. Having said that, go back. There is this. I mean, it's pretty unreadable book by Joseph Schumpeter, the great economist, and it's called Business Cycles. It's 2-volume works. I don't know, 1,000 pages. So I'm probably one of the few people who've actually tried to read it, and I'm not sure if I got anything out of it. But except for one insight that Schumpeter says is that when you have a new, a new technology that destroys all profitability of previous existing businesses, think of it in evolutionary terms. It becomes a sort of extinction event, and then Schumpeter says that actually lays the conditions for a very serious economic crisis. So I would sort of, and with this build-up of debt and this build-up of valuation of assets, this virtual wealth, I mean, I don't know it's necessarily my sort of, that I don't think that that's necessarily my prediction of what's going to happen, but it's something that I sort of ponder a bit. That it's not so. I'm not really worried about everyone losing their job, and then because my view is that that the past people would have found different things to do. It's not as if you can never really be short workers. There can never really be a limitation on what people can do, because we, for better or for worse, humans have sort of infinite wants, and so we can find things for people to do. And weirdly, the richer our societies come, in a way that we actually suffer. We often don't seem better off in many ways. So I don't know if I don't think AI is a problem, or even robots are a problem in that way. I think the problem might be if the AI reaches some of what those who are touting it, if it achieves what some of them say, it could destroy a lot of businesses. You destroy a lot of businesses, you put people out of work, and they can't pay their debts. Then, and you could see if that was happening very quickly, then you could have a very broad-based economic crisis. But so that's something to bear in mind. But I'm not personally very worried about humans just having nothing to do. It may be that they have nothing to do because they can't be bothered to do anything. We'll just sit in front of a computer or a TV screen. But I think that'll be their own choice rather than one that is fundamentally thrust upon them.
Interesting.
Do you have any predictions about the next speculative mania that might appear before our eyes in the coming decades?
What is the next modern tulip crisis?
No, I mean, I'm sort of backward looking, and so I never, things that come around the corner always take me by surprise. And so, I mean, I wouldn't have thought that I wasn't anticipating that the AI, everyone would get in a lather about AI as they've done in the last 9 months. And I mean, really, because OpenAI launching its ChatGPT is, it's sort of, most of the AI stuff, what they call AI, has been around for years. And yet last year, as you probably saw, the big, the so-called Magnificent Seven, all these big tech companies and Tesla added $5 trillion of value on the back of a lot of AI hype. So I think we better see how that plays out before one gets around to thinking of another bubble. I keep on thinking that the age of bubbles is over. I mean, it shouldn't. And once it's over, then I'm sort of out of a job. But that's fair enough. But it always. And so I was thinking, the .com. This will be the end of speculation. They'll just, all the speculators, having been burnt, will stop playing around like this. And then, of course, they went from day trading, internet stocks to flipping condos in Miami, and then, from flipping condos in Miami to, trading cryptos and meme stocks and so on. So it just got, the things got crazier and crazier. And at some point, it's got to come to an end. I'm not saying the speculation will come to an end, but the age of speculation, it will and must, I think, come to an end, because, as Keynes says, if I'm not quoting him accurately, but if the capital development of a country becomes the outcome of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done, or something like that. Basically, I'm just saying that speculation can throw out, these, amazing companies and so forth, but the net effect of a highly speculative society or economy is one that lurches from crisis to crisis, and each crisis. This is probably a point that but I can imagine that Steve Keen or Michael Hudson would have made the same point, that each crisis costs more, is more damaging than the crisis that precedes it. And I'd also argue it's more damaging and more costly, more geographically extensive. The crisis is sort of taking up more, have greater geographical reach. I mean, for instance, at the moment, China sort of sailed through the global financial crisis, but it's now in deep trouble, as far as I see. And so, and I'd also say that these crises become more complex and harder to understand. I mean, either I'm becoming dumber, or I'm finding that these, to actually analyze, to find out where the actual source of the problem is, I'm finding harder. And so, again, I didn't used to have a huge amount of time for sort of Marxist stroke Leninist analysis, but you can see, the classic Marxist analysis, that the systems, the instability of the system becomes so great that it eventually collapses. And I think that Marx got it wrong. In some way, I didn't think. I think the sort of theory of focusing your entire analysis on the exploitation of the working class, and was going a bit far. But I think there is something in the question of whether the crisis become bigger and bigger and more unstable. I don't think that has to be the case. In my reading, it's largely to do with the interference with the system rather than in the inherent failings of the system as it is. But either way, I think you're going to have a reset at some stage, and that's why I always say to my wife, you don't really want to believe in capital. You were talking about people depending on finance capital. It seems to me very important to continue earning a living, actually, however much money you have, just to have, so that you have a stream of income, so you have something to live off. The whole thing. I mean, you might lose your job at the same time, which is no good. But at least, I as I say, I sort of believe in income. I believe in working, really. As opposed to, thinking that there's a rentier existence that one might have. But, that might just be personal predilection. I don't know.
Maybe you're just old-fashioned. I mean, I inherently agree with you, because I think that there is a value from meaningful work. I think that the problem comes where people have a really hard time finding something that is meaningful. And so you end up latched to something that you do, not because you love it, but because somebody hired you to send emails. Like David Graeber wrote that, Bullshit Jobs. And you can argue about the specifics of his analysis where, I don't know if you've read it or not, but he basically has collected all of these reports from people who work jobs where they're going absolutely crazy because they're not paid to do anything. It's all these stories of people that are stuck in the middle management structures of companies. And they're like, I send 3 emails a week and report to an internal system that appears to just be made in order to spin the gears inside the company, and it's not geared into anything that's actually accomplishing anything. And these people report just massive psychological trauma because they're like, I'm being paid money to do nothing, and I feel like I am a waste of space in the world because I have to be there for 8 hours a day. And I show up and it's just, some people just play video games on their phones all day. Some people just find ways to creatively waste the time, but I can't live like that. And so I'm constantly just struggling under the burden of what am I doing here? And I think that the criticism that people have of this is that they're like, well, that's not possible. Like, companies couldn't possibly do that. I think that it's like the efficient market hypothesis, right? Like, the company would not create a job that isn't bringing value to the company because that would be a complete waste of money. And so clearly his analysis is just anecdotal and this isn't the case. But I do think that work is good for people because we all have this inherent desire to make something in the world. But the work that people often find, like flipping burgers at McDonald's or something, is not deeply meaningful. And so the future would require people to have work that isn't just drudgery.
Yeah, that was sort of, as you probably know, so Marxism spent a great deal of time writing or thinking about what would happen after the revolution. But I think he sort of describes someone like be a lawyer in the morning and I don't know what, a farmer in the afternoon, and take the stop working in the evening, early in the afternoon. I don't know what people will do. I do think I didn't know, and I haven't read the Bullshit Jobs book, or did hear about it. But I do think that, and it's I have been thinking that we also live in the great age of bureaucracy, and you see in all these in a number of different areas, a number of sort of bureaucrats, controllers, sort of increasing. HR, has become much bigger than it used to be, and you find that in academia you find more administrators than teachers. In healthcare you find more administrators than teachers. You find in finance, increasing number of regulators, compliance officers, and so on. And so there's we live in an age of super proliferating bullshit jobs, and they're not just bullshit jobs, because bureaucracy also seeks to control other people's lives. If they were just sending 3 emails a week, they would be fairly harmless if sort of driven to boredom. But actually, lot of the biggest bullshit jobs are actually messing up other people's lives. Sort of ruining the delivery of healthcare, or making, or ruining, pushing up the cost of education and dumbing it down at the same time, so making other people's lives. And I have thought about, at one stage I thought of even making that, subject to my next book, a sort of great history of bureaucracy. Why the hell do we live in the most Kafkaesque world that was ever created? And then I thought it was, too depressing a study and also too exhaustive.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So what is the subject of your next book? Have you decided?
Not really. I have a sort of small project which is helping. My former boss in Boston is a sort of very brilliant figure. He both as an investor and an environmentalist, called Jeremy Grantham. And Jeremy, in the investment world, he launched the first index fund in America, and he'd been an innovator. But we came together because he's a great enemy of the speculative bubble, and so now I'm helping Jeremy write that book. He's also an environmentalist. He's given away, I think he says, 96% of everything he's earned. He lives quite frugally and has his foundation. And he, and so we haven't touched on it, but talking about his view is that economics has got things completely wrong because they don't understand the limitation of resources. That we're on a finite planet, and a finite planet, you can't have infinite growth, or you can't have infinite utilization of resources, because you'll run out of them sooner or later, leaving aside any externalities, such as pollution and whatever follows from that. So I'm helping Jeremy with that project, and then I've got some thought of writing about Dan. I love Daniel Defoe. Have you read Robinson Crusoe? And I don't know if you read any Defoe, but Defoe is very interesting in writing the late 17th, early 18th century about. He's a sort of merchant who's always going bust himself. And he has these very interesting observations on the nature of credit and on the nature of markets and commercial activity and so on. So I thought I might try and write a book about the birth of capitalism through the eyes of Daniel Defoe. That's my sort of. I'm not sure if anyone will read it. I think I might. I like to write it because I love reading everything Defoe writes, and he wrote huge amounts. He's one of those people who obviously couldn't put a pen down, so his collected works come to sort of 50 or 60 volumes. So I could sort of immerse myself in that for a while.
I read Robinson Crusoe when I was a kid, and so I feel like the economic analysis of the times went completely over my head. But I think that the question of the birth of capitalism is very interesting.
You can read. I mean, I recommend you can read. Go home and read Crusoe. Read Robinson Crusoe. It's staggeringly well written, very humorous, and actually, it's considered a sort of a model of economy. So it's a one-person economy where Defoe has to sit. He's thinking. He's got some seed corn. Shall I eat it or shall I grow it? So it's actually a model of an economy. It's not just Defoe. He also in all his works he's sort of playing around with sort of early commercial life, and he's also very aware of corruption. And he wrote a pamphlet called "The Villainy of the Stock Jobbers Detected." The stock jobbers really being what we'd call an investment banker. So things haven't really. The truth is, things haven't really changed that much. Well, as they say, human nature doesn't change.
This is very true. I mean, this has been a really expansive conversation. I have a lot of things to follow up on and much left to think about. So I really appreciate you coming and giving us this time.
Good. Well, I hope it worked for you.
Absolutely. I mean, I really enjoy having people come back after the initial conversation, because I feel like our first conversation is sort of laying out the groundwork for the ideas, and then we go away and we learn some other things, and then we can put other things in front of you and get your perspective. And maybe even we've had Michael Hudson and Steve Keen on the show together, and it might be interesting to continue to develop those roundtables because they're really fun.
I've never I corresponded with Michael Hudson. But I haven't actually met him. Steve, I have met a few times. But I like Michael Hudson. And he publishes his stuff himself. You notice that? And I can't understand it. I mean, he probably needs a bit more editing. But it seems to me that should have perhaps he sells well. But it seems to me that his work definitely deserves a larger audience, I'd say.
He seems to have a really surprising reach. Like we had him on, and we're still a pretty small show, but we had 50,000 people watch that episode, and he's regularly lecturing. I think that he gives big lectures in China a lot, and so he seems to.
Did you say in China?
In China, yeah, he's like very popular in China.
Really?
And so he has his own distribution network, and I think that because we're working on publishing our first book right now, and the process of going out and finding an agent and then petitioning the publishers and all of this process is it takes time. It takes you away from the thing that you want to be doing.
And then the other thing is, as you probably know, the publisher takes between 85 and 90% of the proceeds, whereas if you do it yourself, you can catch 60%. I mean, it should be more really, but I'm not a big fan of publishers. I'm a big enemy of publishers, but I haven't quite ever made the. I mean, I feel that way, but I feel I would have written more in my life had the publishers not taken 90% of the proceeds of what I wrote, and they still are. So one constantly has to do other stuff to earn, a living. So I think, I think self-publishing is a good idea. I just think the trouble is that you go more under the radar. Like, I don't see Michael Hudson's books sort of reviewed perhaps as much as they might be otherwise, but perhaps it makes no difference. Perhaps he's fine. He could, as I say, he could have done a bit more editing, but then, the publishers don't do much editing nowadays either. So perhaps that wouldn't make much difference. Anyhow, so it's been nice chatting to you, and I'd better go and cook my dinner and feed my dogs, and perhaps we'll speak again one day.
I look forward to it.
Thank you for your time.
Bye then.
Have a great evening.